First thing I have today is this USA Today report on policing titled Dead Rats, Death Threats, and Destroyed Careers, How Law Enforcement Punishes Its Whistleblowers. And it goes through, this is a really long article, and so I'm not going to be able to get through every last story they detail in here. Overall, they looked at 300 stories of cases where police came forward with alleged misconduct by their fellow officers, and it kind of breaks down how a lot of these were handled. And so, again, they get into individual cases in here, and some of them are certainly worth reading about, but they do have some overall conclusions, and two of those are, of course, that the blue code of silence exists as a culture throughout America's police forces. In the article, it specifically says that it doesn't matter. They looked into police forces that were majority white or majority black or any other union, non-union, anything else, and they found this culture of policing, whether they had specific laws passed, different accountability measures, systems put in place through all the departments. They find a systematic culture of the blue wall of silence, meaning that you don't snitch on your other officers. And they also found that whistleblowing is a lifelong sentence, meaning that if you are an officer that comes forward and says that, hey, my fellow coworker did A, B, or C, he planted drugs, he hit somebody harder than he needed to, he made a false statement, whatever it is, if you do that, you will be weeded out of police force. And so, so many times we see officers who have, famously murdered people or committed abuses, such as like the Kenosha police officer that shot James Blake. They end up being back on the job, where officers who have never abused anyone and who actually are, the kind of people that I would want as a police officer, who are willing, to report a crime, even if it is one of their co-workers. That's, if you're gonna have a police force, those are the kind of people you want. Through this, they describe that those people can no longer get a job. And so I think there's 4 or 5 findings here that I kind of want to go through and read off. And these are the general conclusions of looking at the 300 cases. Cases of retaliation appeared in every type of department: majority black forces and majority white forces, union and at-will agencies, rural 2-man outposts, and massive urban police department, and perhaps most notably places that have adopted strict accountability measures. Reforms like body camera and civilian oversight boards proved virtually worthless when law enforcement leaders and other local officials silence whistleblowers. And so it's, saying that the real problem is that even if an officer wants to come forward, even if there are mechanisms and systems in place, it is actually the culture of policing at the fundamental level that prevents this from coming to the light and systematic changes from taking place. Because if you are a cop and you won't go out there, and we'll get into the reasons why in a minute, and if a fellow officer shoots somebody unarmed, right, you're going to lie in your police report and make it sound like that officer had to do it, because you have to defend your fellow officers. It's a brotherhood. And again, they also say police leaders weaponize internal affairs, pursuing minor rule infractions such as breaking the chain of command in order to discredit whistleblowers and get rid of them. In Louisiana, a detective who admitted to helping the FBI investigate fellow cops was fired for accidentally mislabeling 2 evidence bags, including one that simply had an extra 0. In Kentucky, an officer who testified against its chief was targeted for firing after he added $250 to the accounts of 2 jail inmates who cooperated in an unrelated investigation. And so this is kind of saying that, look, these departments that actually do adopt systems to weed out officers who engage in abuses actually have weaponized those systems against the officers who are actually trying to use those systems to hold actual rule breakers accountable. Now, look, the guy who mislabeled the evidence beds, whatever, that is just clearly abusing and targeting a whistleblower. The person who added $250 to the accounts of 2 jail inmates who cooperated in an investigation, that's a bad practice, no matter how trivial the amount of money is. And this is a trivial amount of money, but what the officer was exposing and what wasn't investigated by internal affairs, and the officer who wasn't punished was doing things far more significant than the officer who just gave $250 to the 2 inmates. The next one. Police unions play a critical role in enforcing the blue wall of silence. They often back cops accused of misconduct during disciplinary hearings, but not those who turn them in. In East Haven, Connecticut, a sergeant who tied an inmate to a fellow officer by holding a gun to his chest was hired by the union to help officers involved in on-duty shootings. Unions have also lobbied for rules that make it harder for officers who want to come forward and easier for departments to hide misconduct. And so there's a couple things going on here, and they say they reviewed 80 union contracts. The first is that if an officer does something that gets them fired, that is so abusive that they get fired, the union will then hire them and replace the lost salary that they should have. They committed a crime. Really, they should be in jail, but now they don't even really suffer a financial penalty for losing their job as they're hired by the union. But even worse, not only is that officer not punished, but now that officer is instructing and directing the culture and the way other officers police. Absolutely insane. All right, and then, they say the lobbying for rules. There's kind of two things going on here. Is one, they make it harder for officers to come forward. So things like, let's say you want to, you see a fellow officer, you're one of 5 officers that sees another officer beat some guy in handcuffs, maybe punch somebody too hard, something like that. Not a shooting or something like that, but something wrong, right? And you want to come forward and say something about it. Well, they're going to write in specific rules that say, actually, you can't do that anonymously. You have to allow the officer who knows who's coming forward to make that complaint. Things like that are real problematic. Also, then you have things like the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights, which says that, law enforcement officers, if they shoot somebody, they get 24, 48, 72 hours or something to be able to get their stories in line. Other officers likewise are allowed to, talk with that officer. They could line up their stories before they come forward and other things like that. And these are all pushed and promoted and advocated for by police unions, which, by the way, are public sector unions. So our own tax money are going to these unions that are going to then advocate for police officers, who not only, let's say some officer kills some guy, right? The police union is going to hire the lawyer that defends them. They're going to, try to at least fight for that officer to be able to keep their pension, if not actually keeping their job. A lot of times those officers will then be able to go and get hired at another police department anyways. But the unions are really key in this, and I was really happy to see the USA Today report call them out. And just how our tax money is used against us here. The last major finding, police chiefs and sheriffs who retaliate against whistleblowers rarely face serious consequences. Top law enforcement officials kept their jobs or were allowed to retire or resign in nearly all instances documented by USA Today. In a rare exception, the director of a training academy in Albuquerque was fired after she was caught on tape threatening to expel students who had complained about her to human resources. And so you actually have to be a cartoonish level of criminal or just wrong, abusive misconduct to be held accountable as a cop. And when you're at the top, you're the police chief, right, or the leader of a police department or a supervisor, sergeant, or something like that. An officer comes to you and levels a complaint, and then you use them mislabeling evidence. One officer in here was at a jail, right, and he was complaining that, hey, my fellow prison guards are abusing the inmates. And then he unbuckled his taser inappropriately. Even the inmate in the situation said that she wasn't threatened by it, but nonetheless, it was a violation of code. And they used that to fire the officer. And that officer hasn't been able to get a job in any other police department because, they put on his record that he was somebody trying to come forward. Right. But then the officers who weaponize that retaliation, if they get moved out of their position, they get just put into another position, or again, they get to keep their pension and retirement and things like that, or they just get to keep their job. There's no responsibility, and that's the level that you need to have the responsibility. They also point out in this article something that I think is really important and something that we have talked about on the show in the past, and as much as it would be nice to be able to just go at a federal level, at a state level, at a local level, and say, we're going to put these laws in place that, say police officers had the right to come forward, that police officers, will be protected. They won't be fired for coming forward as whistleblowers and all this other stuff. It doesn't matter because the problem is at a cultural level. They say in here that dead rats were used, placed, in officers who told on other officers, who reported abuses, who reported actual crimes. They used dead rats to intimidate them. They put feces in lockers. They made threats. Several officers, because of either the blow to their reputation, the social problems that came with this, you lose all of your friends and stuff like that. The fact that the system then turns against you and you have to hire lawyers and pay out of your own pocket to try to defend what you did. This destroys people's lives, destroys people's marriages. And honestly, from what the USA Today is describing here, while they didn't document this, it wouldn't surprise me at all if, officers who become whistleblowers end up committing suicide because, all of your friends turn against you. Your wife is mad that you're doing this. You become depressed. A system that you believed in. A lot of people who become cops, from the time they were kids, they glorified cops in their minds. They saw them on TV. Everybody was, the guy who goes out and does the right thing, who saves the little kid from the shooter, and realizes that the system is this corrupt. It absolutely, ruins their lives and makes them depressed. And so I won't, be surprised that, people who become whistleblowers, end up killing themselves and other things like this. This is just absolutely insane, that the cruelty that these people are treated with for coming forward and trying to report on these crimes. A few officers who are fired for reporting crimes. A South Carolina officer reported a group of other officers who beat somebody who was in custody and then later died. Florida detectives reported his boss, who had sex with a 16-year-old and then paid for her to have an abortion. He was fired for reporting that. In Oregon, there was an officer who was bragging about killing an unarmed man, and then the officer who reported that was fired. There was a case in Louisiana where there was an officer who was reported another officer using racial slurs, and she was moved out of her position. I think ended up just quitting on her own because of the environment at the police department for that. It's absolutely nauseating, this article. It goes on and on and on, and it really just at no point gets better or makes you think there's really anything that could be done about American police to fix the problem that we have, unless you find some way to actually hold officers accountable for committing crimes. Now, one of the very easy things to do is when things are recorded on video and obvious, to make sure that, district attorneys and stuff are taking initiative to charge these as crimes and to, treat police crimes as crimes of anybody else. Somebody's handcuffed and the officer throws a punch or a kick against that person, you charge them for aggravated assault 100% of the time. You put them in jail for years, as you would if it was the officer that was handcuffed and the person who was handcuffed kicked the officer in the face. Other short of that, I don't know if anything is going to change. I don't think you could really expect police departments themselves to self-police and to really get into and find it. It's going to have to be ambitious prosecutors going after cops and stop wasting times on drug offenses and stuff like that. Couple other policing stories I want to talk about here. Kevin Strickland was convicted in 1979 of a triple murder and, to life in prison, of course, for triple murder. And now there is a Missouri, in Jackson County, Missouri, the prosecutor says that I believe she believes that Strickland was wrongfully convicted. There's, two kind of important things here. The first is that the first time he went on trial, there was one black member of the jury, I believe it was a woman, and she refused to find him guilty. And then there was a second trial with the all-white jury, and then he was found guilty. So of the 24 people who heard, this man's trial, the one black person thought he was not guilty. Maybe that's a sign that something was wrong here. Now, the main evidence against Strickland in the case was fingerprint evidence on, I believe, some shotgun shells and on a car. Strickland says he regularly used the car and had given the shotgun shells to the person who actually was the killer a full week ahead of time because he said that he wanted to do some test shooting, which, look, I grew up in Missouri. Anybody in Missouri knows that, somebody asks you for some spare bullets, you give them some. This isn't something crazy that happens, and simply doing so doesn't make you guilty of any crime. The fingerprints that they found of Strickland's on the car, he said that, his buddy didn't have a license, and he did, and so he drove his buddy's car for him. All this really made sense. The main witness in the case, Cynthia Douglas, has now passed away, but she had 3 family members who testified that Strickland, that Douglas was pressured by cops to testify against Strickland. There's also 2 other people who are convicted of this crime. It seems that another piece of this whole puzzle and why Strickland was maybe, I don't know, I don't want to say taken advantage of by the police or something like that, but one of the ways that, this case he was wrongfully convicted is when he was picked up by the police and questioned, he was high and drunk. And I'm guessing at the time he felt like admitting to that was probably enough to get him put away for a while, which probably was true, which, led to him being questioned in the way that he was. And so now you have, Missouri, where you have a prosecutor who's actively advocating, saying, look, this guy didn't commit the crime. And yet a lot of people within the state state government, governor, attorney general, Supreme Court are actively preventing this guy from getting out of jail, who has clearly, it seems, suffered enough. Now moving to a local thing to where I'm at now in Colorado, and also important to the libertarian community. Johnny Hurley, who was shot and killed over the summer by Arvada police, which is a town outside of Colorado. Hurley, of course, was the man who, when there was a mass shooter, Troikey is the guy's last name, he's out trying to kill a bunch of police in a pretty crowded and like a little plaza area. Old Town Arvada is what it's called. And so Hurley comes, he engages Troikey and kills him. Cops come and then kill Hurley. So we now have from police, the attorney, I guess not from police, the district attorney of the first judicial district, Odysee King, saying that the officer in this case will not be charged. I don't believe they identified who the officer was, and they also didn't release the video of what Hurley was doing when he got shot. The police, or at least according to the statements from King, alleged that Hurley had gone and picked up the weapon of Troikey and what they say was manipulating it at the time. This was, I guess, interpreted, or at least the police are putting forward now, that it was interpreted that he was trying to undo a jam in the gun. I kind of have the sense that if Hurley did go and pick up the gun, maybe what he was doing was trying to unload it or get it away from Troikey in case, he were to grab it and start shooting it again or something like that. Throughout this whole thing, the police have called Hurley a hero time and time again. However, they refuse to hold his killer accountable, and they refuse to release the video of him being killed by police and exactly what he was doing. Now, there's a great documentary by Ford Fisher, and a lot of Hurley's friends have put out that they don't think Hurley would have gone and picked up the gun, and so it seems maybe questionable this was the case. Maybe this is the police trying to cover it up. We can't know for sure. It does show the picture of the gun at the crime scene, does have the clip out of it. That's why I'm somewhat suspect that maybe, he did go and pick up and unload this gun, and then the police came around the corner and just started firing. Now, just merely holding the gun wasn't it like the police can't just go and start randomly firing at people because they're holding a gun without, making any effort to have them drop the gun or anything like that. And so I think all of this is very problematic on the part of the police. However, just based on what I talked about in the USA Today article and how all this works, not very surprised the police officer isn't going to be held accountable in this case. This from the Washington Times. Biden crusade against domestic extremism spurred thousands of FBI probes, and there is now apparently 2,700 ongoing FBI investigations into domestic terrorism. This is more than double the amount usual, which is, I think, 1,000. And so, look, I've been saying this for a while. I'm expecting there to be a lot of trumped up cases, not unlike what happened with the Whitmer kidnapping plot, where they're going to essentially not radicalize, but entrap people into, saying stupid things, agreeing to do stupid things, and essentially entrapment plots to generate cases of what they're going to call white domestic terrorism. From the Military Times, Arizona eyes using National Guard to help staff jails. In the Maricopa County jails, I think they have over 700 open staffing positions for their prisons. I'm guessing that this maybe has something to do with the horrific conditions in jails, the fact that almost every one of Arizona's prisons are at capacity, and so they need every possible person. And maybe with the COVID regulations and stuff, nobody wants to go deal with prisoners and wear a mask for a bunch of hours a day, probably have to get vaccinated and everything else. And so they're looking to use 135 members of the National Guard to fill those positions. Now, as I just talked about with the culture in policing, I definitely think that it stands, and also often it's actually on a just the sheriff's departments will be in charge of prisons. And so it's not like, it's not common for this to be the case that police are in charge of prisons, but where they are just prison guards, and it's either run by a prison company or, run by a warden who's employed, maybe directly by the governor or something like that, and just hires people to be prison guards, which I do know is the case in at least some states. It's all part of this policing culture. I'm guessing a lot of this extends to the military as well, with as far as, not telling on people and all of that. And so I'm not expecting this to be a good situation, I guess is what I'm saying. I think there's going to be little oversight and regulation for the National Guard. Anybody who signed up for the National Guard definitely didn't sign up to be a prison guard. It's one of the worst jobs you could possibly have. All prison guards are absolutely terrible, terrible people. And so This seems like an awful policy. Now, one last policing thing I want to talk about on today's show. This from the Army Times, and it's one of those stories where you read it and it just keeps getting worse and worse as you go down. The title is "She Was Just Doing Her Job. Homeless Vet Loses Service Dog During Arrest for Panhandling." The vet here was an Iraq War vet, I believe from the early 2000s, 2004 or so. Joshua Graham Rohrer, a homeless veteran in North Carolina, says he was wrongfully arrested and mistreated by police officers who also tased his service dog Sunshine. And so this is his 2-year-old service dog, and he did get this service dog from the VA. It's just, not some guy with a dog claiming he's got a service dog or anything like that. So he was sitting near the median of a shopping center when somebody called 911. And, one of the real villains in this story, and we don't have this person's name, but whatever absolute piece of human scum called the cops on some guy sitting in the median deserves actually to be the person who was arrested and mistreated by the police officers. Absolutely unbelievable that you would call the cops on a guy because he was sitting there with his dog. And they say that they thought he was using his dog to get sympathy, to get money. Well, let me tell you something. Look, if you need your dog to get sympathy for you because you're homeless and people don't care enough about a homeless dude sitting there, but they care about the dog who's also probably, not having enough to eat and everything like that. I mean, there's a lot of messed up priorities in all this, in all these cases. And it's just really, really disgusting. Particularly, one of the real evil people here is the 911 caller. So anyways, the cops, they show up, and I don't know, rather than saying like, hey buddy, like don't ask anybody for money or anything like that, what they do is they wait for somebody to flag down Rohrer here and offer him money. He goes, takes the money, and then the police come, and boy, do they have a reason to arrest him now. Well, maybe not actually under law, but, according to the law that they think they're able to enforce, him taking money, they think is reason to arrest him. They go up to him, they ask him for an ID card. He says that he doesn't have one, and only has a VA ID. This somehow leads to police to throwing him into the hood of the car. This causes his service dog to jump on the hood of the car and, to try to come to the aid of his owner. There's nothing in here that suggests the dog in any way acted aggressively towards the police, but seemed to be just acting within the training of the service dog to try to get to his owner and to calm his owner. So the owner is, asking for police to let him go so he could get control over his dog. It's also very important to note that under, I think this is North Carolina law, whatever the state that he was in, and also as just a general principle, if somebody has a service dog, they are allowed to have that dog with them, regardless if they are being arrested or not. You can't just rip a blind guy away from his dog because you say that he was panhandling or something like that, and that's essentially what they did to this homeless veteran here. But wait, it gets even worse. As the dog was trying to calm her down, they decided that what they needed to do is aim and fire their taser at the dog. And this, they actually do say that, I guess, the dog nipped at one of the officer's ankles when they were getting the officer down from the hood of the car. And at that point, they tased the dog, tased a service dog, causing the dog to run away. And then they beat up the veteran even more. So he gets arrested. Fortunately enough, one of his buddies was able to come and get the dog. Although I guess, with the duress of being tased, separated from the owner in such a violent way, after the guy was able to get control of the dog was able to then get away again. And it was discovered a couple days later after being hit by a car. So Joshua is released from jail. He finds his dog. It's been hit by a car. And and he feels like, especially during his time in prison, he wasn't treated with any amount of dignity, and that the officers actually laughed at them when he was begging them to let him take his dog with them. And so all this stress and trauma causes Joshua to try to jump in front of traffic. Very interesting that he tries to take his own life in the same way that his dog died. And it's only then at that point that he's able to get some additional care and housing from the Veterans Administration. At this point, the cops have not been charged yet. And of course, I mean, like, if they were an officer in my town, I would be absolutely horrified that people with this level of brutality, yeah, you know, again, this is a homeless veteran. This is somebody who, you know, feel the way you feel, people in my audience, about the elevated position that veterans get in today's society, particularly from police. The fact that police would treat a veteran in this way, it is unbelievably horrifying. And again, the fact that these officers aren't in jail yet just goes up to the thing we talked about at the very start, where there's such a culture in the US for, you know, our police officers to be able to do what they want in front of other officers, in front of the population at large, abuse people in any way, abuse animals in any way that they want, and know that they will not be held responsible. You know, one of the things that I didn't mention in the USA Today article that's headline, but I'm sure is a huge deal for police officers: if you're considered to be a rat or a snitch, people will not go when you request backup. Right. And so then you feel like telling on your fellow officers is putting your own life on the line. And maybe that is the excuse and the, you know, kind of mental gymnastics somebody would have to do to watch their fellow officer shoot and tase a service dog, and then throw a veteran, a homeless man, onto the concrete pavement, throw him onto the car lid, abuse him for absolutely no reason, and not say anything. All right.